This is the story of a man who realized that being home alone wasn't just about being by himself. It was about being completely invisible to the things living in the dark. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We promised you a true account of supernatural isolation, and tonight you're getting it. Eric thought he knew his house. He knew the squeaks in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, and the way the wind always hit the west window just right. He lived there for 20 years. But on the night his wife and kids went away for the weekend, he learned that the house had secrets it only shared when he was truly, completely alone. If you feel like your house is listening, you might want to turn up the volume. Eric poured a cup of coffee at 11 p.m. It was Saturday night. His family was visiting his wife's sister 3 states over, and Eric had the place to himself. The silence felt heavy, but good. He sat on the couch and put his feet up. The only noise was the gentle tick-tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound he barely noticed most days. Around midnight, he got up to get a glass of water. As he walked toward the kitchen, he noticed the tick-tick was gone. He stopped in the hallway. The house was dead quiet. Not just quiet, but wrong quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making them feel stuffed up. He looked at the grandfather clock. The pendulum wasn't moving. It had stopped right at 12:03 a.m. Eric shrugged it off. It was an old clock. Maybe it needed winding. He went to the kitchen and got his water. When he came back, he saw something that made the hair on his arm stand up. The front door, which he had double-locked, was slightly ajar. The inside safety chain was dangling, unlatched. He hadn't heard a thing. No scraping of the lock, no click of the door opening, no sound at all. Eric felt a spike of cold fear. He was a big man, but the emptiness of the house made him small. He checked the locks again, pushing the door firmly shut, and then he added a wedge under the door handle for good measure. He tried to go back to watching television, but he kept listening. He listened so hard his jaw hurt. The silence was still total. Even the sounds from outside, the distant traffic, the occasional siren, the crickets were completely muffled, like the house was sealed off underwater. That was the first sign that the atmosphere in the house had changed. The second came an hour later from the upstairs bedroom. Eric was sitting downstairs when he heard a thump. It was a solid sound, like a large, heavy book falling onto thick carpet. He knew the sound well. It was the sound of the old dictionary they kept on the bedside table. He froze. He hadn't been upstairs since before his family left. Nobody was home but him. He stood up slowly, grabbing the heavy fireplace poker. The feeling of being watched was suddenly overwhelming, pressing on his neck like a cold hand. He climbed the stairs, moving carefully, trying to make his own footsteps silent against the unnerving hush of the house. The hallway upstairs was dark. He flipped on the light. The door to the master bedroom was open. He pushed it all the way in with the poker. The room looked normal, but then he saw it. The massive dictionary was not on the floor. It was sitting right where it belonged, on the edge of the knitstand. But there was something else. On the wall, just above where the book was a faint, dusty handprint. It was too small to be his. It was the size of a child's hand. He touched it. The dust came away on his finger, meaning the house-cleaning crew hadn't missed it, which meant it was fresh. Eric backed out of the room. He realized that the thump he heard wasn't the book falling. It was something else hitting the wall and landing silently. The dust print was the last touch. This meant whatever was in the house was capable of making noise only once, and then disappearing into the soundless vacuum that had taken over his home. He retreated downstairs and sat by the kitchen counter, the poker across his lap. He stayed awake, watching the darkness in the living room. At 3:00 he heard a whisper. It wasn't in his ear or coming from the next room. It seemed to come from the wood itself, from the very frame of the house. It was a cold, dry sound, like fingernails on a dry leaf. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Mockery. The whisper sounded like a crowd, but only one sound at a time. It was a chorus of faint, dry voices, all saying something quick, before the next one took over. The noise was only present for about 5 seconds, and then the awful silence clamped down again. Eric felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to know if he was going crazy. He needed an anchor to reality. He went to the basement stairs and opened the door. Below the steps was a small window. He could see the outside light coming in through the small square. He listened. Outside the window, he heard nothing. No wind, no crickets, no far-off sounds. It was still, total, deep silence. But when he walked down the first 2 steps, his foot landed on a loose board. Kriak. The sound was loud and sharp. Too loud. He realized the awful truth. The sound hadn't been swallowed. It had been removed. The house was not silent to the things inside it. It was only silent to him. Everything he heard, the thump, the whispers, were sounds that somehow bypassed the thing that stole all the ambient noise. He stood frozen on the stairs. That's when he saw the movement. It was not in the basement. It was in the thin space between the bottom of the basement door and the floor of the hallway. A deep black shadow, flat and wide, suddenly stretched itself across the hallway carpet. It wasn't a shadow from the lights. It was a shadow that seemed to be created by the lack of light. It looked dense, like liquid tar, and it began to creep up the wall towards the ceiling, stretching and spreading, totally silent. Eric stared up at the ceiling, where the dark shape was now hovering, making the wallpaper look dimmer beneath it. The shadow wasn't looking for him. It didn't see him. Because he was the one making noise. His own breathing, his heartbeat, the slight tremble of his clothes, all these things were making too much sound in the vacuum. He was too loud to be heard in the silence. He backed away slowly, still gripping the poker. He went into the powder room, locked the door, and stood in the dark. He held his breath until his lungs burned. He stood perfectly still, trying to match the silence of the house. After a few agonizing minutes, the dryness in his ears lifted. He heard it, a faint, low, constant hum. It was the low buzz of the streetlights outside. The sound barrier had dropped. And when it did, Eric heard other sounds, the scratching of something thin and sharp against the outside of the powder room door, followed by a heavy, wet thud as the door handle was tried violently. Whatever was in the house was now operating by touch and sound, but it couldn't tell the difference between ambient noise and a person. When the silence had returned, it couldn't see him. But when the house began to sound like the real world again, the hunt started. Eric spent the rest of the night standing in the powder room, holding his breath, listening for the awful moment the outside noises would vanish again. Every time the hum of the street lights faded, he knew the house was starting to swallow sound again, and the things that hid in the noise vacuum were close. He knew that when the house was truly silent, he was safe, but utterly invisible. And the moment the noise came back, he had to be ready to fight something that saw him only as a noise source. He made it to dawn. When the first ray of sunlight hit the powder room window, the cold in the air vanished. The street sounds were loud and clear, and the thump at the door had stopped. He unlocked the door. The hallway was empty. The dusty handprint on the bedroom wall was gone too. Eric never told his family why he had all the floorboards replaced that week. He never told them why he bought 3 noisy, ticking grandfather clocks and placed them on every floor. He needed noise, constant, confusing, real-world noise. Because Eric knew now that when he was truly home alone, the house was never empty, and the things living there were only harmless when they couldn't hear the silence of their own existence. Eric learned the hardest lesson of being alone. Silence can be a trap. The things that hide in the supernatural void don't hunt you. They hunt the noise you make when you try to hide. The house didn't just swallow sound that night. It spat out something that could finally see. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If you felt that familiar chill run down your spine, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more tales from the dead of night. This is the true account of a young woman who thought her biggest problem was missing her roommates, until she realized the presence next door wasn't human, and it needed her to think it was just as lonely as she was. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. We promised you tales of supernatural loneliness, and this story proves that sometimes the only thing scarier than being alone is thinking something else is too. Sarah lived in a small, shared apartment. Her 2 roommates, Mia and Chloe, were gone for the Thanksgiving break. Sarah was home alone for the first time in 5 years. She found out quickly that the apartment building had a tenant they never saw, a presence that used the silence to perfect its disguise. Get comfortable, but keep the lights on. Story: Sarah missed the noise of her roommates. She missed Chloe singing off-key in the shower and Mia loudly heating up popcorn every evening. Now, the apartment was vast and echoey. On the second night of her solo stay, a Friday, she was sitting in the living room trying to read. It started with a faint scratching sound. It came from the wall shared by her apartment and the empty unit next door, Unit 4B. The scratching sounded exactly like a fingernail gently tapping wood, repeated quickly. Tap dash tap dash tap dash tap. She tried to ignore it. The building was old. Maybe it was settling. Maybe it was a mouse. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be an animal. It paused, and then it started again, this time a little louder, a little closer to the center of the wall. Sarah got up and pressed her ear against the drywall. The tapping stopped immediately. Dead silence. She waited for a minute, then 2. Nothing. She stepped away, walked into the kitchen, and the tapping started again. Soft and hesitant, right where she had been standing. She felt a strange mix of annoyance and unease. Was someone playing a prank? Unit 4B was supposed to be empty. The landlord had told them it was being prepped for new tenants, but nobody had moved anything in or out for months. She decided to test it. She walked back to the wall, loud enough for her footsteps to carry. When she got within 2 feet, the tapping ceased. She waited 5 seconds, then quickly knocked on the wall twice with her knuckles. Knock, knock. She heard an immediate, identical reply from the other side. Knock, knock. Sarah's blood ran cold. That wasn't a prank. That was a response. It was too fast, too perfect. She knew it wasn't a human playing a game. A person would have hesitated, or laughed, or done something to break the tension. This response was immediate, like a reflex. She slowly backed away, eyes fixed on the wall. She felt a deep, chilling dread. Whatever was in 4B was listening to her, mimicking her, trying to prove that it was also just alone in an empty space. For the next few hours, she tried to focus on her book, but every few minutes, she'd hear a new sound. A light sigh, very quiet, like someone letting out a long breath they didn't know they were holding. Then, the sound of movement. It wasn't loud, heavy walking. It was a slow, shuffling drag, like dragging a large, heavy cloth across a hardwood floor. The sound moved slowly from one end of Unit 4B to the other. Sarah looked at the clock. It was 2 in the morning. She finally gave in to the fear and walked down the hall to the apartment's front door. She peered out the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit and empty. She turned back around, feeling foolish. That was when she smelled it. A powerful, ancient smell of wet earth and something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers. The smell was concentrated near the wall of 4B. She went to her kitchen drawer and pulled out a flashlight. She shone the beam on the wall. The paint was peeling slightly near the baseboard, and the wood trim looked damp. As she watched, a thin, brownish liquid began to seep slowly out of the crack between the trim and the carpet. It wasn't water. It was thick and dark. Suddenly, a sound erupted from the wall. It wasn't scratching or tapping this time. It was a muffled but distinct cough. It was a wet, rattling cough, like someone struggling to clear their lungs of something heavy. It lasted a few seconds, ending with a soft, desperate whimper. Sarah realized this was the entity trying to sound sick, trying to sound vulnerable, trying to make her feel sorry for the thing next door. It wanted her to believe it was just another lonely person, maybe someone elderly or hurt, alone in the empty apartment. She fled into her bedroom and locked the door. She piled pillows against the door to feel slightly safer, though she knew they wouldn't stop anything truly supernatural. She sat bolt upright, listening. The shuffling started again, slower now, weaker. It moved from the common wall towards the front door of 4B, which was across the hall from her own front door. Drag, 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 then silence. Sarah heard the distinct sound of a key being inserted into the lock of Unit 4B. The tumblers clicked. The lock turned, and she heard the squeak of the neighboring door opening just slightly. A breath held for too long escaped Sarah's lips. She shouldn't move. She shouldn't make a sound. But she couldn't help but look through her peephole again, just one quick look to confirm the door of 4B was actually open. She pressed her eye to the hole. The hallway was still dim. And there it was. The door to Unit 4B was open about an inch. Just enough to show a dark, absolute void inside the apartment, a darkness that seemed thicker than the regular hallway shadow. Then, from that inch-wide opening, something moved. It was a long, pale finger, incredibly thin, stretching out and tapping the wall right next to her own peephole. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was inches from her face, clear and sharp. The entity had gone to the hallway to knock on the outside of her door, just like she had knocked on the inside of the wall. It was imitating the action, forcing the interaction. and in the low light, the finger looked like dry bone, unnaturally long. It paused. The tapping stopped. A low, dry whisper came from the inch-wide gap of the neighbor's door, aimed straight at her peephole. It was a single, three-syllable word, sounding exactly like a plea. "Hello?" Sarah knew then that she was not home alone. She was the audience for a performance. Whatever was in 4B was using the lack of human noise to mimic the sounds of loneliness, trying to lure her out, trying to make her open her door. She spent the rest of the night curled up, holding her breath, listening to the shuffling sounds and fake coughs and taps, which now sounded frantic and desperate. It knew she was awake. It knew she was listening. It was trying to pretend it was just a neighbor who needed help. But the stench of wet decay and the unnatural movement of the shadows proved it was anything but. When her roommates finally came back Sunday night, Sarah acted normal. But she didn't tell them that the entire hallway outside 4B was now completely covered in the thin dark brown liquid, or that the door, which had been open an inch, was now tightly shut, the lock looking brand new, untouched. She had learned a terrible lesson. When you are home alone, sometimes the greatest danger comes from the thing next door that is trying to prove it is alone too. The true terror of the home alone experience isn't just the isolation. It's the realization that some entities are just lonely enough to learn how to imitate a friend. Sarah only survived because she refused to believe the sounds of distress coming from the empty room next door. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If this story made you look at your neighbor's door just a little closer, hit that like button and subscribe for more chills from the Black Hour stories. When a man inherits a strange iron box, he discovers that being home alone means being the keeper of a terrible, ancient ritual that demands constant, silent company. Welcome to the Black Hour stories. Tonight we finish with a lesson in cursed objects. Mark thought inheriting his uncle's old house was a lucky break. It was a beautiful place, deep in the woods, far from neighbors. But with the house came a peculiar, heavy iron box, and Mark quickly found out that some objects don't just sit in a corner, they watch. This is the story of the lockbox ritual and the price of being its only observer. Mark's uncle, Silas, was a strange man, obsessed with relics and strange customs. When Silas died, Mark got the house. The will was clear. Mark had to live in the house for at least a year before he could sell it. Mark moved in, thrilled by the solitude. The house was cluttered with ancient junk, but one item stood out, a small, heavy iron box about the size of a loaf of bread sitting on the mantelpiece. It was black iron, forged crudely, with no hinges or seams. It was sealed shut, like one solid piece of metal. It had a single, thick, tarnished brass padlock attached to a loop on the lid, but there was no keyhole. The padlock was also solid, like it was melted onto the box. The uncle's lawyer called it the lockbox. He said Silas had kept it with him always, and Mark was instructed never to move it from the mantel, or try to open it. Mark was home alone for the first week, trying to clean up. He kept finding himself drawn to the box. It didn't look special, but it felt intensely cold, even in the warm living room. When he put his hand near it, the air felt thick, heavy, and very still. On the third night, he was watching TV when he felt a shift in the air. The house suddenly felt like someone had walked into the room behind him. He spun around. Nothing, just the dark hallway. But when he looked back at the mantelpiece, he saw something unsettling. The lockbox had changed position. When he left it, the solid brass lock faced the left side of the room. Now it was turned slightly, facing directly at the couch where he was sitting. It had moved maybe an inch, but enough for the difference to be obvious. He got up and walked to the mantel. He put his hands on the box. It was cold, unnaturally cold. He pushed it back into its original position. It was too heavy for a mouse or the wind to have moved it. He sat back down, trying to convince himself he was tired and imagining things. He stared at the box. After maybe 20 minutes, he saw it move again. Not quickly, but slowly, like a watch hand ticking forward, until the brass lock was once again pointed right at him. It was watching him. The next day, Mark decided to try and break the padlock. He got a hammer and chisel. He lined the chisel up against the crude brass, ready to swing. As he raised the hammer, a sharp, terrible sound came from inside the house. It wasn't a sound of something breaking or falling. It was a quick, dry snap, like a bone breaking, immediately followed by a low, desperate hiss that seemed to come from the hallway floorboards. Mark froze. He lowered the hammer. The sound stopped. The silence came back, thick and judgmental. He looked at the lockbox. The brass lock was shining, almost reflecting the overhead light, looking brighter than it had a moment ago. He put the tools away. He knew that the sound was a warning and the box was protecting itself. He learned the rule quickly. The lockbox must be watched. When Mark turned his back, things went wrong. If he slept, he'd wake up to the smell of dust and sulfur and the sound of tiny, quick scratches behind the walls, getting closer to his bed. If he left the room to go to the kitchen, he'd come back to find every chair slightly moved, pointed toward the lockbox. But when he sat in the living room and stared at the box, the house was peaceful. The air was calm, and the strange, sickly sweet smell vanished. The box demanded his attention. It needed to be observed. It needed company. He started keeping rituals to satisfy it. He would sit for hours, just staring at the heavy brass lock. He learned that if he looked away for too long, the lock would start to change color, turning a dull, sickly green before quickly reverting when he looked back. He knew the green was the box getting angry. One night, exhausted, Mark decided to try and sneak away. He put a large, ornate mirror directly in front of the mantelpiece, positioning it so the lockbox was fully reflected. He thought if it could see itself, that would count. He went to the bedroom and lay down, closing his eyes. For the first time in days, he felt a measure of peace. It lasted about 5 minutes. Then he heard a sound from the living room. It was the sound of a very heavy object slowly scraping across the wooden mantel. SCHHH-SCHH ... Then a loud, awful crash as the heavy, ornate mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. Mark ran back into the living room. Shards of glass were everywhere. The lockbox was now sitting right in the center of the mantel, the brass lock facing the smashed mirror. And the lock was intensely, violently green. Then he heard the whispering. It wasn't coming from the box itself. It was coming from the broken glass. He bent down, and from the fractured pieces, he heard dry, airy voices, too fast to understand, all combining into a chorus of frantic, angry noise. It sounded like the whispers he heard were talking about him. He quickly sat on the couch, fixing his gaze on the bright green lock. Slowly, very slowly, the green faded back to the tarnished brass. The whispers in the glass died out, and the broken mirror was silent. The house settled down. Mark stayed on the couch, staring at the box, for the entire night. He realized the thing inside the box, or the thing connected to the box, hated being reflected. It didn't want to see itself. It wanted to be seen by a living human. The lockbox wasn't keeping something in. It was the focal point of a ritual that demanded constant human witness. He was the one who was truly locked in. He never tried to leave the room again while the sun was down. He sat, staring at the box, becoming weaker and thinner every day. He knew he was fulfilling his uncle's terrible requirement. When his year was almost up, his wife came to check on him. She found him sitting in the living room, completely wasted away, staring blankly at the mantelpiece. He wasn't dead, but he was barely alive. The house was spotless. The lockbox was centered on the mantel, and the brass padlock was shiny and perfectly still. His wife rushed him to the hospital, and he never went back. But the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him, just extreme exhaustion. When the new owners moved into the house, they took one look at the strange iron box on the mantel and immediately threw it in the trash. The next day, the new owner found the box back on the mantelpiece, sitting exactly in the center, and the shiny brass lock was turned toward the couch. The ritual had a new observer now. Mark escaped the house, but the lockbox remains. That small, crude piece of iron demands company, and it will always find someone home alone to watch it. Remember, sometimes the things that truly curse a home are the things that hate being unobserved. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. If you're checking your own mantelpiece right now, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories for more tales of haunted objects and terrifying nights.